I'd like actually now to take this opportunity to introduce our keynote speaker, our first speaker of the conference here today, and that is Mr. Patrick Debois. Mr. Patrick Debois, everybody. So a little bit about Patrick. Patrick's been around forever in the game. Again, he's the godfather of DevOps. I've had the pleasure and the honor of knowing him for, well, about a decade or more now. We've been at conferences together. We've done material together. Super, super happy to have him on board. Since that first DevOps in 2019, he has talked and walked the DevOps path from sort of a fringe idea to a mainstream term. And for better or for worse, our LinkedIn profiles were forever changed by the work that he's put into place. So without further ado, take it away, Patrick.
Thank you, Dan. And something I've always wanted to do is to say, DevOps Days Ukraine, 12 points. DevOps Days, 12 points, because, many of the other events supported this event, and sponsors and attendees, all 12 points, or for Dan, 12 points. It's been an amazing thing for me to see that the community is coming together for this event. I'm going to try to be on time, so I'll kick off with my presentation. This is a presentation where I actually go through all the talks that I've given about DevOps, and I made a YouTube channel out of that, and I have 130 presentations. So I'm not gonna, present all slides, but I picked a few for each of the years. So let's kick that off. This one is even pre DevOps Days, 2007, where I presented at a Java conference, and I was getting a little bit fed up about receiving tarballs or war files, and I called it the lost use cases of operations. And Agile was kind of coming into existence, and I was very excited that this was changing the way development was done, and it was more humane. And one thing I always found that was missing is that when you looked at the definition of done, it went from planning to live, but then after life, what was missing? And I think that operations at that time was missing. So I gave a talk, and I was very focused on this operational part. A bit later, I actually presented at an Agile conference. I sent in a paper to be able to attend for free, right? That's how it goes. And I explained my experiences trying Agile principles in operational world. I did one of the first experiments of doing Kanban in operations because Scrum didn't work well. In operations, things are very ad hoc. So I kind of rolled into this model. Hey, I can come out of operations and move a little bit more agile and kind of work on those parts. Learned a lot, didn't go well the first time, went better the second time. And then I think in 2009, we called it DevOps Days. I always say it's by accident. And I figured it wasn't just about that operational parts. It's about the collaboration between dev and ops. And I call it the hippie days because, you're totally excited about this new thing called DevOps. And this might be for you early in the journey, coming from that operational side or coming from the dev side, and you get all excited about that part, and that's great. And you should keep that energy to keep going. I looked into systems thinking, how we could improve things, and I made this mental map of the IT world. And you will see somewhere on the right, there's the ops parts with the sysadmin and the people from the networking, and on the left there were the developers. And I think my mental model was that I was slowly crawling out of the operational side and creating the bridge through the testing environment to the developers. And at that time, CI/CD, CI was coming up, and they still call it insane. And you will also see that kind of the cloud was getting some attention in 2010. And basically, we're reconciling two worldviews. The dev saw the world as going as fast as possible and moving features, and the ops folks say, it needs to be stable and it needs to be working in production and keep on working even after developers are gone. So that was, operations went to delivery as my model around DevOps. And, in the beginning, people kind of called continuous delivery the suicide route. It was the insane level, X amount deploys a day, but people were trying to explore this and getting up to this level. And the cloud helped escape from the traditional kind of IT environment. And in many cases, it was actually causing technical debt. And you might recognize this picture as being later reused when Pete Cheslock made his picture around DevSecOps and kind of security. But a lot of it was, we're the guards that kind of make sure that whatever goes into production is quality, works well, is monitored, has a backup and all that part. In 2011, even though the cloud existed and CI/CD was happening, more and more tools came around. You had Puppet, Chef, CF Engine, and others. There's a complete explosion. And I learned that while many say DevOps is not about the tools actually bootstrapped a different way of working as well. So I've learned in 2011, yes, there is a place for tooling, there is a place for DevOps as a collaboration, and both go hand in hand. So it's not that strict as people call it sometimes. I did my own part, creating some of the tooling around, at that time, Vagrant. And I think the similarities between open source in general and sharing and working in the open is something we've done in DevOps days, a lot. And I think that spirit is also, you do things and you share things. And if you remember the CAMS acronym from the culture, automation, measurement, and sharing, then the sharing is also predominant. And I think it's many of us had this background of open source and sharing. I started trying to figure out what the structure was in this madness. And I had this overly complex, hey, I'm an engineer, graphic. And I called it area 1, where you put something in production. And then area 2 is the feedback channel. And at that time, people were still thinking a lot in projects, not in services or products. So, once a project was done, well, then the team left. And I put area 3 and area 4 in there because I thought there was a longer feedback loop. This kind of model with 4 areas got later reduced to the 3 ways, and kind of like go left, go right, and then kind of continuous improvement. But this kind of was my model on not just the operations in production, not just on the delivery, but kind of keep the cycle going of feedback and improve on not just the one delivery, but the permanent delivery of the product. In 2013, people were already challenging me, and what is the future of DevOps? Because we have all the tools, we have CI/CD, and people more and more started implementing this. And obviously, I made this slide, and I don't have a crystal ball. Then I don't have it now. Well, I might have one, but it's not really working very well for me. But I think what dawned to me during that presentation is that DevOps sparked a lot of things, like Agile sparked other things. And if you look at the center, there was DevOps Days Ghent, and we got some friends at Gardeners. We got some pushback, people calling it no-ops. We got the DevOps cookbook. There was an attempt to certify and trademark DevOps, which didn't work well because there was so much prior art of people kind of blogging about that stuff. And eventually we even, got mentioned that the Obama team for the elections was using DevOps. And it was amazing to see how that growth of IDs kind of, came from this little accident in Ghent in 2009. But I think that the most important was that even at that time, I was thinking that DevOps will not go away. And I called it the DevOps meme map. And you might think about DevOps Borat. But in essence, it was that DevOps as a concept, as an ID, will always survive, much like a meme meme is the smallest piece of cultural kind of change or cultural ideas. And I think that's how I thought at that time about DevOps being there and just growing and growing. Then I thought, like, how hard can it be, right? You do your own startup. And what's interesting then is that I learned about all the mantras. They're good, but they might fail you. For example, you might say, well, you need to deploy faster and faster. And then all of a sudden, Apple in the App Store says, sorry, you need an approval. So again, an edge case. Or you might say, we need to run all the tests before things go into production. Well, I was doing live support for TV shows. We only have 1 hour that the show needs to work. We needed to deploy during that 1 hour, but our tests would take 1 hour. So we kind of had to make a systems like what tests cover what changes. Another mantra busted. Um, you should automate all the tests. Well, automating all the tests for things you create every time new is quite expensive. So it's okay to do manual testing. So again, I learned more about the edge cases of all the mantras in the world. And it kind of broadened up my perspective to be more nuanced on that stuff. More and more, the cloud was there, but the services became useful. And then at that time, serverless AWS came around with the AWS Lambda. And what dawned to me is that I had been looking too much just on dev and ops collaborating inside the company. Somebody who's very well savvy in Agile said, the problem is that once you solve the internal problem between dev and ops, the problem goes outside of your group. And in this case, it might be your SaaS service. You cannot call Amazon and say, please reboot something. Yes, you can open a ticket. You kind of have to start thinking about them as suppliers. And I thought, hey, but will DevOps just go away and end as being an API and that's it? And we don't talk to each other. I learned that SaaS suppliers actually talk to ourselves. For example, when they publish a retrospective or a postmortem, when you meet them at conferences, they talk to you. They talk through us through their documentation and their ticket systems. They talk to their release management. So it's a different form of collaboration, which I see as a supplier management. Everybody kind of supplying dev and ops with the necessary capabilities. These days you might even think that open source libraries are a kind of suppliers into the organizations, and it's really hard to control them. You can support them, but you create like this similar relationship like DevOps, but with your suppliers. Then this book came. Gene Kim kind of pulled this together with us as a team. It was very heartwarming to see that it was not just in the cloud. People from the bigger enterprises, it was not a gimmick anymore. So I think we reached at that time peak in any company that, there was no excuse left to do DevOps in a way. Remember that I did, join that startup a couple of years before. It failed, and it didn't fail because of DevOps. I learned that when you look for your bottleneck, and it's not in dev and ops, it's not in your suppliers, it might be somewhere else. Is it in HR that you can't hire the right people? Is it in marketing because you don't describe well and you can't sell the product? Or in sales, you can't sell the product very well? So the thing is that we're working in a bigger system than the map that I initially draw, and there's a lot more complex. And IT is one of them, and we shouldn't feel special in a company. We're just one of the many parts in a company that make success. And just as a side note, the reason why I used horses is that unicorns don't exist, and I learned that really hard. People started calling this biz DevSecOps, many names, but for me it was the map had expanded from that simple thing, dev and ops and the operations, to this bigger worldview. Later, after the startup kind of failed, I moved into a security company. And I came across this kind of drawing where it was about trust. And it always fascinated me. And when I go back in one of my early presentations, I talk a lot about trust and building relationships when you do that. And I think what was interesting is that they put like 4 facets. And many times in DevOps, we're focused on the competence. Oh, is he doing this technology well? Does he know what he's talking about this technology? Is it the newest thing? But there's way more things to build a full trust. Are you sincere? So do you actually mean what you say every time? Are you reliable? Will you show up at postmortems? Will you be there as a security person when there needs to be a bigger launch and you will have the team? So are you reliable that you show up and whatever you say that is sincere, that you kind of are reliable there? And then the 4th dimension, which is probably even the biggest one to make the trust work, is do you even care? Because if you don't care, you can be sincere, you can mean what you say, you can be reliable, show up, walk the walk, and you have the competence. But if you don't care, then the trust is not enough. And I see more and more that DevOps, or the relationship between the teams or intern or other parts of the organization, is build that trust. And if you look at those 4 parts, I think you will get a good view on maybe you shouldn't be only working on the technical competence, but also on the other parts. So I challenge you on that. So eventually, there wasn't a definition in the beginning. I was taught that Agile had like a very narrow, very concise definition in a couple of sentences. I still had many books, and I never wanted to write this down. But eventually I wrote this down, and I think DevOps or DevSecOps is everything you do to overcome the friction created by silos. Whether that's your dev, whether that's your HR, whether that's your supplier, it doesn't matter. There a friction between the 2 groups, then I think you're over, and you try to overcome this, then you're doing DevOps. And of course, you can do it through engineering. That's the competence, but there's a lot more to build that trust relationship. And then I learned about the collaboration culture differences. And there's a book, Reinventing Organization, that talks about how this has evolved over the years. You might remember the command and control. We do this very power centric, and then from there we kind of move into automation and predictability and stability. So much like in the factories, we kind of move into this repeatable thing. And then, of course, to improve, we need to measure, and that kind of, we do the pay KPIs or SLIs, SLOs. It doesn't matter. So there's this mentality of measuring. The next part is about empowering, and that's creating services, that's creating a platform for others, that's kind of collaborating with the teams and see what they need. And eventually we're now moving to an autonomy of teams where you build it, you run it, you kind of have a small slice you take care of, and that's the part. What's actually more interesting is that there is a paradox in this part, is that the more you try to command and control, often the less you have control, or the more you measure, the less useful the measurement becomes. And it's a mixture of kind of all these paradoxes. We talk about autonomous teams, but the more we talking about autonomous teams, the more parts we start sharing in the cloud and kind of build a platform over that. So there's a paradox that we kind of never get away. And the culture of a company is never one of those. It's a mixture of those. So you need to be aware that, like, whenever you try to move from one to the other collaboration culture, other parts of the company will stay. And that's kind of my insight. Like, whatever you try to optimize in the system, that system that you're optimizing might have different collaboration cultures. And eventually, we spread into DevOps architects, AI ops, many of the different titles, and Dan mentioned it, LinkedIn titles. It doesn't matter. Like, as long as you're collaborating and removing that friction, as for me, that's kind of where where we're heading. And I think that's okay. We're probably going to change, and it's okay. Whatever we do in a company, is it after autonomous teams or during autonomous teams, things will change. Complexity is on the rise. We all know the YAML, the kind of the Kubernetes, and it's complex, but everything on that is okay. We'll survive. There will be friction. The bottleneck, we move from one part to the other. You can't escape this complexity. And now, instead of having lived on-prem or having lived projects, it's a cloud native world. We live in services, so we can skip the other part, and that's okay. We're all going to survive in that world, and no silos are already forming. For example, I hear about platform teams that try to abstract themselves away, but they're actually abstracting themselves away and not talking to the teams anymore, or only to a few teams, and kind of that will create friction again, and that's okay. We'll live through it another day, and the new tools will be built, to support autonomy, to kind of delegate things, to do their own testing, and that's all fine. And I think I'm fine, and I'm hoping you're fine. The fact that you're watching is that you're in a safe space, I hope. And I think eventually DevOps will be okay, and DevOps is okay. So that's kind of how I moved from the simple thing like, hey, in operations, I was shouting and I was receiving the wrong thing, or the complexity in an organization with multiple cultures happening at the same time. And that kind of broadened my perspective over those 13 years. Thank you very much. And this was my talk. And I hope you support this event by donating or like tweeting or making some noise. Thank you very much.
Once again, we have to imagine the thunderous applause from the many tens of thousands of people packing this arena.
Exactly.
Excellent.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for coming through, for preparing that talk, for giving us sort of a not just it was almost a retrospective, but it was forward looking. There was a lot going on there, and I really want to sort of call that out, because a lot of talks that one might attend about technology, about cultural movements, about managerial practices, dare I say, and certainly talks about DevOps as well, have been sort of looking backwards in a lot of ways. I've been going, like, this is what we've done, and this is these were our retrospective on it and stuff like this, and that's important and good, but the forward-looking statements I think are critical, perhaps now more than ever, right? Like, where are we going, and like, how can we use what we know and the experiences that we've gained to actually progress forward, right? And so in that vein, I'm going to throw a real open-ended question at you, and it's a very short question, but it's good. I think maybe a tricky one, and that is, for you, kind of what's the next thing, right? We did the DevOps, we won, right? We did it. Everybody's got the DevOps now. What comes next? What's that next evolution? Where are we going to see the next sort of cultural, managerial, collaborative innovation space? Where's it going?
Yeah. So I mentioned at the end that I'm more and more seeing the trend towards these autonomous teams, and I think that's quite interesting, and it has been kind of this theme of empowering the team does well. I think more and more companies starting to struggle when they are having 20, 30 autonomous teams, and they're autonomous, and how do you foster collaboration between those? And like, can you still kind of make sure that they are collaborating and they're not just looking for their own kind of benefit in that aspect? And that puts a change on how you manage those teams, because they're self-managing. You can't really tell them what to do. Operations can't really say, hey, here's a solution, please use this. And that whole dynamic will change in the teams. It will also, I expect, to change the tooling, how we work with. We've been so used to GitOps and kind of have this visibility, but I always give the example around the trusts in there. If you have a security team and you say there's some guidelines that they should do, and here's a whole pipeline, and we make that shared pipeline, uh, what if the pipeline fails for a day? Do you expect the people to do the right thing without the tools? Yes or no? And it's kind of that, like, the values that you're put into those teams, not just the pipelines, but the values of those teams. Are they about collaborating? Are they going for the shared goal instead of trying to go for their own goal? And that's at least an interesting puzzle that I look forward to, like what happens. And even in on innovation, I've seen the trend of the Ivory Innovation Group says, please go to that tool, do this. Well, it doesn't work anymore in companies. So do we expect the teams to do their own innovation? Yes, no. And kind of, anyway. So that's the playing field that I think is interesting about autonomy, but still working together. Anyway, that's kind of the puzzle. It's not like a solution I'm pitching. It's a puzzle of the evolution.
Well, that's fair, right? If there were easy answers, we already would have come up with those answers, right? So it's interesting that you mentioned this idea of autonomous teams, and how do you get them to work together? How do you know that they are working together? Which is a separate but related question, right? An individual team can do a self-assessment. We've declared particular goals. Have we achieved those goals? Yes or no. If we've achieved those goals, then we can assume that the team is doing what it's expected to do. But measuring how teams are working together, that's a much more interesting question, right? Are they leveraging the capacities and the capabilities and the features, if you will, of the teams around them to actually be able to accomplish their own goals? Are they doing so efficiently? Is there space to optimize there? That's interesting.
Yeah.
Is that maybe somewhere where something perhaps like contracts, promise theory maybe could come into play, right? Where you sort of extending this idea of here's what we're guaranteeing, and then you can measure consumption based on those guarantees.
Yeah. I think we're going to see everybody's going to be a dependency of everybody. And we kind of rumble if we're pulling down Java dependencies or no dependencies, but now they're the other team. And obviously you have to assume that they are allowed to fail. So we will see the dynamic of whatever we think about, and we're already doing this in multi-cloud. We're already assuming this. We're going to assume this internally as well. So again, if you say contract, that might be too heavy a term and might be a little bit loaded. If you say I do my best to attain this, but by saying I will do my best, I make it clear that I might fail, and you should also work if I fail, or at least have a mechanism to cope with that. And that's, I think, in these worlds, it's okay. And the responsibility, like it says in promise theory, is put on you. You cannot tell the others what to do. The responsibility that it keeps working is something you do. In that book that I mentioned, Reinventing Organizations, they say you can take all the ceremony away of having to talk and needless scrum meetings and do all the dance. And what they put forward is that if you think somebody else is impacted by their work, by your work, you should notify them. And it is up to you to understand who you're impacting, who you're providing the service for, and not the other way. Others should not be coming looking for you, like, oh, is it like it's part of you, what you do. You play nice in the ecosystem. That's part of your role. And at least you have that conversation. You might disagree, but at least they're aware of what is changing. And I think that's a sane philosophy to handle that.
Yeah, no, that's fair. So we got a couple questions coming in from the audience. I was not stalling for time before we got those in, but here we go. So this actually question's right in line with the conversation we're having right now, so I'll jump right to it. The question is, do you think that platform teams, quotes, are simply bringing back the old dev versus ops division and thus resetting the loop?
Yes, I see that argument quite often. I think the difference between the traditional ways is that much as we let me reset that question. In the old days, when people asked for a service and they weren't receiving the service from the infrastructure team or from the operational team, they kind of would go somewhere else. And self-servicing has definitely improved that part, so they can kind of, pull whatever they need. Um, but I usually say that nothing was actually stopping us from already doing the services even without the cloud and talking to them what they needed. And therefore I cringe at the term platform teams because it's starting to move where, like, if dev and ops are people, right, or at least groups of people, a platform is moving toward a technology, and we're trying to abstract away what that platform is, much like the cloud. But as I mentioned in my talk, it becoming a service or a supplier, and they communicate through different things. Like, is your documentation up to date? Do you have good status reporting? Do you go to their meetings if they need to? Do you talk to different teams that use your platform? And that collaboration aspect, if you do that right, it doesn't matter how you name it, whether you call it like old school operations or sysadmin or whatever. And it's that collaboration and taking away that friction that makes it interesting. The danger of a platform team is that, like any service, and that's one of the paradoxes. When you're small, you're building a SaaS company. Um, you're building it for everybody because everybody can be your kind of customer. And after a while, you're gonna build this for 5 or 6 personas if you're really big, and they're paying, and all the rest, it's not a good use case. And so it's kind of similar. So you will need to know when to drop it, kind of tell them nicely, and support them in kind of a different way. But you cannot force everybody in the same kind of paradigm of working. The examples I gave in the in the mobile world, right? And some use cases don't fit well, and it's kind of that conversation: does it fit or not? Make it self-servicing, and please, please, please keep on talking to each of the teams to understand that you're building the right thing with your platform. So
Excellent. Thank you. One last question, and this is the lightning round. All right. So here we go. As someone that is forming a new DevOps team in a software company, what's the one thing you wish you knew when you were starting out?
uh, instead of trying to come with a solution, just go and ask what the pain is. Like, whatever that team does, is don't think in solutions, and just try to learn what problems you're trying to solve from others and not from yourself.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Good advice. Sage advice, really, DevOps or otherwise, frankly, right? Aim at the problem, not the solution. The solution will present itself. Excellent.
We're
Well,
smart
thank you
enough for a
so,
solution.
so much for your time, so much for your presentation, so much for your answers, putting up with my Q&A. Super appreciate it. Once again, virtual round of applause, everybody. Patrick Debois, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Drew. Have a good event.
Thank you very much.